All right, my friends, welcome to yet another presentation of DBA Fundamentals. This time we have Matt Gordon telling us about how to crush a cloud migration, moving mountains while migrating data. Today is October 4th, 2022. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see the three co-leaders of the DBA Fundamentals group, Steve Cantrell, Shane O'Neill, and myself, Kevin Wilkie. To the right hand of our names, you'll be able to see our Twitter handles if for any reason you get hold of us. Below that, you'll see the many various ways that you'll get a hold of us on social media. Top there is Meetup, probably the way most of you found us today. Go to our website, you'll see all kinds of times that we meet in the future, some in the past, all kinds of things about us. Below that is one of the ways I love to get a hold of DBA Fundamentals, our actual webpage itself. You'll find all of our upcoming presentations as well as our meeting archives. Lots of goodness there. Also below that is one of my favorite sites on the web, DBA FunTube. It is obviously the most fun place you'll find on the internet for all of your presentation needs for a DBA, or anyone who truly wants to be one just doesn't realize it yet. You'll find our past presentations. Be sure to like them so that whenever you actually we post a new one out there, you can know about it as soon as possible, and you can watch it at any time. Obviously, when you're staying up late or watching a 2-year-old baby nap, that's the perfect time to watch that because it will keep you awake. Thank goodness. Also below that, you'll see our Twitter handles, Slack channels, and LinkedIn groups. So be sure to reach out to us on any of those ways, whichever you find easiest, and we'll reach out to you, talk to you, all kinds of stuff on any one of them. As always, all sessions are recorded and usually available within 1 to 2 days. Like I said, check us out on dbafuntube.com. Today, be sure to remember to turn off your camera, unless your name is Matt Gordon, and be sure to mute yourself as well so we can focus all of our attention on you and the presentations. Also, be sure to type any questions into your chat as well so that I can interrupt Matt often and ask all kinds of questions. So with that, we turn it over to Matt, and he'll give a much better description of himself and whatnot. So with that, over to Matt.
Okay. All right. Let's get the screen shared, number one. And should see my PowerPoint in a second.
I see it there.
There we go. All right. Okay. So thanks for that. Like I said, the way Teams shows, because I'm on a Mac and I think it's peculiar to this version. I can't really follow along with the chat very well, the way everything kind of panels out. So definitely want a lot of questions if you've got them. Go ahead and type those in the chat, and I'll take breaks about as often as I can to get into those. And during those breaks, as far as I'm concerned, it's totally okay to unmute and we can actually talk. But yeah, I like these to be interactive, and I feel like this one, when it's in person, there's a lot of kind of back and forth. So I'm hoping for kind of the same thing here. All right. Okay, so this is me. These are all the different ways to find me. I'm SQL at Speed everywhere online: Twitter, blog, GitHub, LinkedIn, all that fun stuff. I've been fortunate enough to help write a couple books that I'm proud of. One particularly tied to this one. That actually came out in August. So not that I'm going to shill for the books much, but if you're diving into a migration project, kind of regardless of role, whether you're a DBA, manager, team lead, executive, what have you, there's good stuff in that book for each and every role there. So very proud of that. It was an honor to be asked to help with it. I also get to play race cars sometimes. So that's why the lovely 5 car is sitting there. I love talking about data and AI focused stuff. but I like talking about race cars more. So if you're into racing stuff, feel free to hit me up and we can chat. Here's some stuff about me. Really, the only interesting thing here is the first and last point. First point is I've been working with SQL Server longer than I'd like to admit. So I do have experience going pretty far back, not all the way back to 7 and 6.5, but starting with 2000 and forward from there. And I lead our data technology group here in my hometown. So I want to take a second and say, thanks for being here. It's obviously been a challenge the last, 2-3 years to keep community things running, and try to figure out what they need to look like and what they need to feature and who's going to show up and all that. So you've taken the first step by being here. Hopefully you'll keep being here, and hopefully you'll look around for things like this that are more local to you. It's awesome to have all these virtual training opportunities, and I hope that never stops. But there's also something to be said for the local groups as well. Some are still virtual, some are hybrid, some are in person. But if you look up, I think it's the Azure Data Community. If you look that up on Bing, since it's Microsoft powered, you can find a group that's local to you, so you can kind of supplement what you're learning here, and meet folks that are closer to you. Like I've said, that the worst case for attending events like this is you're probably going to learn something you didn't know. The best case will be what happened to me. I mean, this has changed my life. The last 3 jobs I've had, I would not have had without getting involved in this stuff. And you can do that as a speaker, organizer, volunteer, what have you. Just thanks for coming, and please stay. All right, so let's dive right into it. So we're gonna talk a lot of tech here, but I'd structured this presentation a certain way because I have a lot of experience on projects like these, good and bad. And when we didn't talk about the why up front, the projects ended in tears. And so that's why I start with why. So if you're sitting there being like, well, I thought this was going to be an hour of tech, it's going to be most of an hour of tech. But we need to start thinking about why are we migrating databases, because that's going to guide the technical decisions that we make. Getting a little background noise from somebody. So if you could please mute, that'll help out. Yeah, if we don't know why we're doing it, we're not going to make the right technical solution, because you may go out there and read a blog that somebody say, well, if you're migrating to Azure, it needs to be to this thing this way. And that's always true, and that's what you should do. My experience is that's not true. Everything I'm going to talk about kind of has its own place. Some of it's really cool and new and fun. Some of it's pretty old school. But depending on what our motivations are, that's how we're going to make the right technical call. So let's talk about what those are. So these are all ones that I've seen. So everything in this talk is things that I've experienced. But I'll say as we walk through these, if you feel like I've left something out, or if you feel like I mentioned one that you don't think is valid, let's talk about that. I have enough content for the full hour, but if it's just me talking for 60 minutes, that might get a little boring. So if you want to argue about any of this, definitely happy to do that. So this first one here, and I used to get this a lot. You'd have a customer and they're like, okay, we're migrating to Azure. Our CIO, CTO, CEO, whatever, has set a goal. It says we're going to migrate to Azure. And you're like, okay, fantastic. We can help you do that. What's your aim? And they're like, oh, we're going to save a bunch of money. Not necessarily. So I'll say this, and this is a point of contention for sure. What would often follow that is that customer would say, well, we're going to save a bunch of money, but oh, by the way, we want you to move everything that we have exactly like it is on-prem up to the cloud the same way and save us money. That's not possible. I would say while the delta has changed over the years, it is still difficult to run an equivalent VM in the cloud. And I'm mostly going to talk about Azure because it's Microsoft partners that I've worked for, but this is, I think, true for Amazon and GCP as well. If you're running a VM equivalent to what you have on-prem, it's still difficult to have one in the cloud that's going to be substantially less than the one you have on-prem. You might get them equivalent. That's probably going to be a little more. In my opinion, where the real cost savings comes in, especially regarding data, which is mostly what we're talking about here, the platform as a service offerings like Azure SQL, that is where the real savings comes in. And consolidating databases from, tens, hundreds, thousands of VMs down to those PaaS platforms and maybe a handful of logical servers or something like that. That's where you can realize the real cost savings. But that's why it's important to establish this up front, because if the customer, or whether you're internal or external, so if you're a consultant here, there's good stuff in here. If you're a full-time employee staring at one of these projects that you know is going to kick off soon, there's good stuff here as well. Whatever perspective you're coming from, if the aim you're given is go save us money, look hard at the platform as a service database offerings. That is probably your best shot at saving a bunch of money. But it's also important, you're going to hear me say this multiple times this hour, to set expectations going in. If you don't, that that first Azure bill can be a real surprise sometimes. So if they say, particularly if it's like, we're going to lift and shift everything we have on prem, we're going to do it to the cloud, and cloud team, data team, whatever, you're going to save us a bunch of money. Stop them right there and say, no, not basically not like that. If we have to move everything as is, the savings are, you're not going to get what you want, and be that blunt, because the bill's going to be that blunt. So if you don't set that up front, they see that first bill and they're like, team, you, whatever, what's wrong? Well, I told you to save us a bunch of money. This is more expensive. You don't want them to find out that way. You want them to find out straight from you early on before the work has started, so you can help guide that conversation towards the platforms that are actually going to help you there. Second point here, actually the not the last large scale project I was on, but the second to last. This was the aim. It was a large medical device maker, and they grew by acquisition. So they had acquired companies all over the world. They had data centers all over the world, Asia, Europe, here, Mexico. So it was, pretty interesting project to work on for sure. But their goal was basically, they were staring down the barrel of having to renew a number of contracts all over the world, some of which were not favorable. They were written when the company they bought was small. After the purchase, obviously, they were then part of this large international firm, and they tend to get better deals because there's, but that's not what the terms of the contract were, and that's not what the renewal was going to be. It was still going to be that small company, arguably kind of overcharging them for things. So the goal that was passed down to their CIO, and then to me as the lead of that, was, we need to get out of our data centers in Hong Kong, in Amsterdam, places like that. And there are hard deadlines on these contracts. In some of them were 5 months, 6 months, 8 months. And then you're going to make some technical decisions that are different, right? Because it's all about speed. So we had a lot of meetings in that where it's, I would put my consultant hat on and act like I didn't have to do the work and say, well, in a perfect world, your end state is going to be this. You're going to end up on Azure SQL Database Hyperscale or something like that. But for a variety of reasons, particularly if it's like, well, that end state is a platform that would require us to change some old code and things like that, wasn't really an option. Didn't have the resources, didn't have time. You would not make the perfect technical call. It was like, all right, well, we're gonna build a giant VM and we're gonna move a bunch of databases up there, because that is what we can do fast. That gets you out ahead of your deadline and things like that. So that it's important to understand this aim too, and this is okay. Like, because we're technical, we're gonna feel bad. We always want the best thing, right? It's like, I want to do the coolest thing, I want to do the best thing for you, but reality bites. And sometimes it's like, well, this isn't cool, but we've got to go fast, and so we're going to do some things that maybe aren't as satisfying, but if it's what the customer needs, if it's where you work, if it's what they need, then it's right. This third one I've experienced a couple times, where I was on a consulting engagement to do an always on AG health check. So nothing to do with this at all. And I get there and the DBA team lead was basically like, hey, if you have some time this week, my team gets a bonus if we demonstrate that we have migrated a database to the cloud. That was it. It's just show that you know how to do it. Nothing strategic, anything like that. It's just, I want you to tick a box and say that you've put a SQL Server database in the cloud somewhere. So my boss told me I had to do it. Is a valid thing. So we built a VM. Took a backup of something on-prem, restored it to the VM, and that was it. Nothing new, nothing fancy, nothing all that fun, but we ticked the box and they got their cash, which is what that was all about. So if the only motivation is I need to get this done to satisfy a bonus, meet a goal, whatever, there's nothing strategic about this. It's not an overall project. It's not an overall aim. That's okay. But again, you're going to change how you migrate that stuff because of what that was. Let's go over a couple more before we go to the next one here. So this one's no fun, but it is valid. So hopefully nobody out there is supporting versions of SQL Server this old. But the reality from having done this one in person a few times is that some of us probably are. I'm not going to do a show of hands because we can't see anybody's hands. But the carrot that Microsoft kind of throws at us here, and this is true for these versions of Windows Server as well, is that if you're supporting SQL Server 2008 or now SQL Server 2012, that happened, I believe, this summer, or Windows Server, either of these, and you're stuck on it. So when I say that, what I mean is, they're like that project that I was talking about earlier. We had a thing where we had a SQL Server 2008 box. We were stuck on 2008 because it was something that one of their assembly plants in Mexico used a particular piece of software that was written against SQL Server 2008. The software worked very well, but the company had gone out of business. So there was no supported version later than SQL Server 2008. And the risk analysis folks at the company, combined with the leaders of that plant, said, you can't change this. We know it works, and we're going to keep it as long as we possibly can because it's basically perfect for us. Nobody else makes something better. So we needed that box to stay on SQL Server 2008, but you want the support to continue as long as it possibly can because we've long since reached end of life there. So what Microsoft will do for you is if you move a VM running SQL Server 2008 or 12, Windows Server 2008 or 12, move it to the cloud, you will get extended security updates for 3 years following that. Now, they're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. You're paying them money to run that box there. But if you're in that world where you're like, well, I have to maintain it on this version because I'm not allowed to change it, we can't upgrade it, whatever the reason is, it's a perfectly valid reason, but then you're going to go the VM route, most likely, because that's probably what the story is there. Probably Azure SQL is not going to be an option because they're going to tell you it's not. And you're like, well, I can run it at the same compatibility level. They're going to tell you they don't care that that's the same, and it has to be a VM somewhere that they can RDP into or whatever. And if you're in that boat, this is what you have to do. But there is kind of a nice thing thrown in for us there. And yeah, so this, SQL Server 2008, its extended support ran out this summer. And I think Windows 2012, actually the extended support goes into next October, but this is valid now. Last but not least, the migration thing is just, well, we just want to go to the cloud. It's just, our CIO saw an ad on TV that says the cloud is great. So it's now a 2023 strategic goal. That's a motivation. And usually that's followed up by right what it says here. We're going to lift and shift everything. We're going to take our on-prem data center and duplicate it, but it's going to be in Azure. As the sub-bullet says, this is not always the right choice tech-wise at all. It rarely is. Sometimes when you're under the gun, under a deadline, like the reasons we talked about earlier, it's valid. But technology-wise, you're not moving anything forward. The coolness of the cloud, the ways you can scale, the things that it can do, you're arguably taking advantage of almost none of it if you're just moving a bunch of VMs up there. But again, If it's a box you have to tick, or if it's the directive you've been given, that's fine. It's important to set those expectations up front. It's like, okay, I'll do what I'm told, but understand you are unlikely to save money. In fact, it's likely to cost more. And sometimes that's okay. They just need to know that going in. So any comments or questions about those before we go into the next section here?
No comments have come through the chat window.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about who can screw this up then, because this is kind of important before we get to the tech. These are things you have to establish early on, really, before you're doing anything technical beyond talking about how you're going to do it and where it's going to go, which we will get to right after this. So how can these be messed up? First things first, management must support this. It's going to cost money. It's going to take resources. It's going to take resources across teams, which is most of what the next two slides are. I have seen these projects start where they're like, data team, migrate our data to the cloud. You got to stop right there, because if you're migrating data and it's in support of an app that runs on the web or middleware or what have you, that stuff's got to go too. Otherwise, you're going to introduce latency that probably is going to make the app perform poorer for users, or may just take it down because it's not really designed to do that. So if you're involved in a data migration and that data is in support of applications, make sure the apps go too, or make sure you set up front, hey, the experience in this app is going to be worse because there's latency between cloud and ground, unless you're spending buckets of cash to have that network be really, really fast. Most places aren't. But management's got to buy in, because you're going to need their help. You're going to need resources from other teams. You're going to need money. You're going to need them to tell other people to do stuff if you're not in a position to do that, and most of us aren't. So they need to be bought in, and they need to be bought in as far up the chain as you think you'll need them. And we'll talk a little later about kind of what that means and how we can help with that. Second, operations team doesn't want to do it. Bring them in early. I was part of a project where it was just like I said, the data team was charged with this, and they're like, data team, move the data, and they got pretty far down the road even before they brought consultants in, which is where I came in. And kind of one of the first things we asked is, well, where's your operations team on this? Because there are obviously networking considerations and things like that. You need to make sure when stuff is moved that it can authenticate the same way it does on-prem, that it's secure, all those kind of things. And the response we got back is, oh, we haven't talked to them yet. We'll just pull them in when we need them. Wrong answer. You already needed them. And what ended up happening here is actually that project missed deadlines because they went to the operations team and were like, hey, oh, by the way, we have this deadline to move all this data. We've already put a bunch of work into it. We need you to do the networking bits. And the operations team said, cool story. We don't have anybody for you for 2 months. And it got sorted. But in the process, it got sorted by really overusing resources on the operations side. And where it ended is their best operations person actually left the team once the project ended. He was exhausted and pretty unimpressed with how that went, and moved on. So you don't want these to end in people leaving because they're frustrated, because they're overworked, things like that. So bring your operations team in early. They need to feel a part of this because they are a part of this. Whether that's what you were told or not, they're very much a part of this. It can also be where your dev teams don't want to change things. Maybe they don't, they don't understand. They think this cloud stuff is a fad. It certainly isn't. But, some people still do think it is, and they don't want to operate this way. If you are migrating home built apps that dev teams are in charge of, you have to bring them in up front and say, listen, we're going to migrate you to the cloud. They need to be a part of the decisions about the platforms you land on and things like that, because some of what we're going to talk about, the database might require code changes to run where in Azure SQL you think it should go. Those code changes, odds are going to have to be done by dev teams, not by you or your team. So bring them in early if you're moving home build apps. Security, super important. If you have a security group, person, whatever, they're going to be interested in this. They should be. When you're putting stuff up in Azure, if you're not very, very careful, you can accidentally expose a lot of machines to a lot of bad people. Don't do that. Um, Bring this group in up front. They're certainly going to have thoughts about how things should be set up and secured and all of that, and you should listen to them. They're in those. It seems like a pain. Yeah, it's going to slow you down, but they have the jobs they have for a reason. And the last thing you want to do is say, well, we met our migration deadline, but oh, by the way, a bunch of our stuff got hacked and we had a data breach because we didn't lock it down right. So bring those people in. And I'll say this, if there's nobody in your org where security is their focus, whatever their title is, bring consultants in to help. This is a critical piece of this. You don't want to move machines outside of a data center that you own into a data center that somebody else owns and not have taken the security context into your mind. This is super important. And that kind of goes hand in hand with this next one. The networking team is going to be a critical part of what you're doing as well. They're the ones that are going to set up the site-to-site VPN or the express route or whatever your conduit is going to be to the cloud. They're going to set that up. They're a critical part of this. They have to feel a part of this project from the start. The good thing is their runway is pretty short. You can bring them in, they do their bit, and for the most part, once everything's set up, they're done. So resources are always a challenge, and a lot of the other teams we've talked about, they're going to have to kind of play along with you for a long time. The networking team, hopefully not. Once you've decided on what platforms you're going to use, you've gone ahead and set those up. They can do their bit, they can lock it down, and then they're through, and they can go back to doing what they do. Last but not least, the DBA team can stall us out here. This is all going to look different to them unless you're running SQL Server on an Azure VM. And I had a couple projects where one of the things that slowed us down and caused us to miss the mark was the DBA team saying, this Azure SQL stuff, I don't understand it. It looks different. When I go into SSMS and I connect to this, I don't see all the options that I'm used to seeing, and I don't like it. You may kind of roll your eyes at that or not, but it's a real thing. And if your whole team is saying, listen, we're not comfortable with this, we've not been trained on this, whatever, you can remedy all of that. But if they're not comfortable, they can certainly throw a monkey wrench into this stuff and basically refuse to work on it. And if they have enough pull, then the whole project will kind of stall out while that gets sorted. So all of these are kind of important things to think about here. So we'll wrap up this section with just a couple things. If you're coming into this from the outside, you need to know the organizational politics that are in play here. You need to understand who can make things go. It's not always the person on the org chart that you think it is. So it's not always that top level, hey, if I just get to my CIO, they can make everybody do the things. Sometimes the CIO, CTO, CEO, whatever, is more of a figurehead. Maybe they're not technical at all, or maybe within the organization, they don't have the respect that title would make you think. And maybe it's somebody a rung or two down who's actually the engine that makes all this go. That's who everybody listens to and says, oh, well, if they said it, we need to do it because they're always right and they always make the right calls. So know that going in can be a challenge when you're always virtual, but it's an important thing to understand. Understand the competing interests at play as well. So I had a project where we were, the operations team hadn't been brought in up front, but they'd been brought in fairly early. And so you start talking about deadlines 6-9 months out and say, this has to be done by this time, this has to be done by that time. And we ran into an issue in that the data folks, their incentives were around that project getting done at that time. The operations folks were not incentivized for that. So they were not inclined to sacrifice their bonus to get somebody else's project done. Now, is that a failure of management? Yes. But you still have to understand that it happened and understand that those people are not probably going to be bought in at the level which they need to be, because it's not it doesn't make sense for them. They're not getting the extra money that the other people working on it are. So learn things like that, build those ties across teams and learn where the centers of power are. Is it the data team that's driving this? Is it IT? Is it operations? Is it networking? Is it the CTO, CIO, whatever? Learn and understand that. That's going to help this go better for you. If you're working from the inside, politics are probably less of a concern. You at least arguably have to learn less about them because you already work there. So you probably know a lot of the players and what their motivations are, what their personalities are, all those sorts of things. And you can, you don't have to get up to speed on that. You also probably likely know how to work up and down the org chart to find people that are going to buy into this for you to get these mountains and obstacles out of your way. And that leads me to where I kind of want to sum this up. These projects for data folks can be an excellent opportunity to kind of feature yourself in front of the organization. So if you have aspirations to go into management or to be an executive or to move up that next rung or two, these are great ways to kind of show that you understand everything in play, you understand everything that's going on, and you can lead this. So if your aspirations are beyond your current roles, um, this is a great opportunity to move that up. So before we get into the nerd stuff, any comments or questions about any of the less nerd stuff?
No real questions here.
Okay, all right, cool. All right, so where are we putting all this stuff? We talked about why we're doing it. We talked about who can throw us off. Where are we going to put this stuff? So I mentioned this earlier. I'll show this to kind of set the table for everything I'm going to talk about in the second half here. We're going to focus, and I pointed at my screen, but you can't see that. So just pretend I pointed right at the middle of this. On-prem, we kind of know that, right? We manage everything, like bare metal, cables, racks, power, all that. That's all us. So, we own it all for better or worse. When we talk about infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, we lose the bottom half of that chart. Storage, networking, virtualization, servers. We don't have to worry about any of that. We're worried about the OS up. So probably for a lot of us, we're running IaaS on-prem. I know that there are still folks that run physical hardware only, and there can be very good reasons to do that. It's still sometimes blindingly fast. But a lot of us are probably running VMs on some host somewhere. And when we go into the cloud, IaaS for us is not really different. What is different is the platform as a service stuff, or PaaS. So what you see there is we're worried about the data and apps, and that's it. We're not worried about anything underneath that. We don't have to patch an OS. We don't have to hack around and make registry changes to fix something and things like that. The cloud provider's handling all that for us. And that's where, in my opinion, kind of the coolness of the cloud comes in. Those are the services that we can scale usually fairly easily, not inexpensively, but easily. That's when somebody comes and says, hey, this is slow. If you have the money in your budget to do it, you just pull that slider a little farther right and say, all right, you've got more CPUs, you've got more RAM. If this doesn't fix it, go fix your code. So PaaS is where we're going to spend a good bit of the next half hour, but we're going to start with IaaS. So from this section is really talking about what our migration targets can be and what some of the reasons might be for those. So I kind of start with what's probably the most comfortable for us, and we'll work up into newer and kind of cooler stuff from there. So SQL Server on an IaaS VM, that's going to be comfortable for us. We can use Azure Migrate to do that. We don't even really have to do databasey things if we don't want to. If the C drive on that box is 2 terabytes or less, we can tell Azure Migrate to move it. It will make a bit by bit copy of it. We can then cut it over, and our VM that was on-prem is in the cloud, more or less. It's not quite that easy, but on a good behaving box, it pretty much is. But going back to what we talked about earlier, we need to think about whether lifting and shifting is the right strategy here at all. It's easy. It's going to cost us a little more, probably. and we're losing, not that you can't scale a VM, but it can be more difficult, especially if you need to jump from the class you're in to a different class where there's not really an easy path. A lot of times you have to shut the box down. So if you're talking about something that you can't take any downtime on, then lifting and shifting and acknowledging that, well, this is a machine whose workload is likely to grow. Are you in a good spot there? Most likely not. Uh, and if it's a critical piece, it's hard to go tell a customer, hey, you're going to have 20-30 minutes of downtime because the VM that all your stuff is on, I have to turn off so I can make it better. The PaaS services, you don't have to do that. So again, did we choose this because it's comfortable? Maybe. And sometimes, like we talked about it earlier, that's fine. We probably didn't choose this for technical reasons. Now, there are perfectly valid technical reasons for this. As cool as the PaaS services are, there are, I wouldn't say performance bottlenecks, because they are very quick, especially if you can spend a lot of money. But there are cases where the performance you're going to crank out of a VM is superior to anything that a PaaS service can offer you. So if you're supporting applications where that performance is very important, you're under SLAs where things have to happen sub-second and things like that. This is a target you should have in mind. And those workloads, if they're that important, you're like, well, you've really sold me on this PaaS thing. It's cool. That's where we want to be. We want to save some money. Test your workloads. It's very important. There are differences in architecture, especially for managed instances, but really across all the tiers that we're about to talk about, that will affect your performance in ways you're not familiar with on-prem. So test, 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 test. And now that I've kind of made you a little wary of PaaS, let's talk about that stuff. So fair warning, this slide, I'm using terms that Microsoft doesn't use anymore. I use them because in my head, they help this make sense. Especially, I definitely had projects over the years where you're sitting in front of the data team and you're saying like, all right, we're going to go to this thing called Azure SQL. And they look at you like, I've never heard of this. I don't know what this Azure SQL thing is. Explain it. And so this is kind of how I like to explain it to those teams. So if you're familiar with Azure SQL, you're probably looking at that saying, well, they don't call it single anymore, and da da da. And you're right. But I like to use this because if you're brand new to all this stuff, I think it makes the most sense. But feel free to comment and tell me that I'm wrong about that. So if you're deploying a single database, because we're going to talk about PaaS services kind of for the rest of this part, it's fully managed. Backups, HA to an extent, all of that, everything's taken care of. It is isolated by logical servers. So if you connect to something and you're connecting to, abcd123.database.windows.net, that's your logical server, and the databases go there. Moving out of that, there is a notion in Azure SQL of what's called an elastic pool. So if hopefully from the last few seconds, you understand kind of what a single database is and what a logical server is, these elastic pools, you're basically giving a shared set of resources to a bunch of databases. So architecturally, this is not right, but if you're familiar with availability groups, that isn't what this is, but it's basically databases that need to play together. And so you give them a shared set of resources, CPU, memory, all that. You say, this pool of imagine it like a real pool. Like you're in there, there's pool noodles, there's beach balls, there's all that kind of stuff. And that's all you get. There's nothing outside. And so they all get to share that. And maybe if one person gets tired and goes and sits in the corner of the pool, then it's more toys for other folks. That's kind of what these are. So it's a way, especially if you're very cost conscious and things like that, you can say, all right, these databases, we're going to spend this much money on them. We're going to give you this much horsepower, and it will sort out internally how to best use that. And then managed instance is kind of the logical extension from these, but we'll talk more about that later because that really deserves kind of its own set of slides. At least I think so. So that's how I did it. So let's dive into more about what Azure SQL Database is. Then we're going to talk about the service tiers that this is offered in. So that you may be sitting here thinking, particularly if you haven't seen Azure SQL or read about it in the last few years, you're like, oh, I heard about that. It's pretty cool, but the T-SQL support's pretty lousy. A few years ago, that was true. There were statements that just weren't supported there several years back. It's no longer the case and hasn't been for a while. It's pretty much the same. And for the most part, the T-SQL that's not supported in Azure SQL is because it can't do it. You're not creating availability groups there and things like that. So those statements just don't work, which makes sense. But a couple things that Azure SQL database non-managed instance does not do is it does not support cross-database queries. There are gymnastics you can do to kind of kludge something together to kind of sort of almost make this work. But out of the box, if you have legacy apps that do this, it's not going to work. And so that's kind of our first red flag here. Like, oh, this PaaS stuff is cool. Ooh, I have a bunch of old code that does cross database stuff. And in normal Azure SQL, it won't do that. Managed instance will. Normal Azure SQL or non-MI also doesn't have SQL Server Agent. So if your servers have a lot of agent jobs on them doing a lot of things, Azure SQL database does not support that. Managed instance does. But again, managed instance, and we'll talk more about that later, substantially more expensive in many cases. So if you're using agent to automate stuff, there are automation options in Azure, Azure Automation Runbooks, Logic Apps, things like that. So plenty of options, but there's not a clear pathway to like, I turn my agent job into a Logic app. It's going to be a lot of humans sitting down doing a lot of work. So there's also these tiers kind of break down two different ways too. So if you go, and in the longer version of this, I would actually walk through it, but with 60 minutes here, I don't. So if you go and provision an Azure SQL database right now, and I actually think you should go to the portal after this, kind of look around, kind of take that tour and go through what I'm talking about here. The basic, standard, and general purpose tiers separate compute and storage. So the performance for you is going to be a little less. Now it's still quite good. Even basic, which I wouldn't recommend for production workloads. I did a thing where I was inserting 15 to 20 million records a weekend into a basic tier Azure SQL database. The substantial portion of those were basically across 12 hours on a Saturday. Never had a problem with it. So basic is pretty feisty. There's a lot you can do with it. Again, not endorsed for prod at all, but basic can be a nice test bed for some things. And there are some limits around it. It's a fixed price, $4.99 a month. So, it doesn't really grow, but it's a good way to kind of dip your toe into this stuff. The SLA on this stuff is 4 nines, which is nice. That's pretty good. Probably better than what you have. If you turn zone redundancy on, that 4 nines goes to 99.995. Again, really solid, probably superior to anything you're running on-prem. Premium and BC co-locates compute and storage. So you're getting greater performance there. It also costs more. But one thing I do want to point out is these higher tiers, especially the architecture under them, is more or less an always on AG. So if you're sitting here thinking, boy, I've got 40 always on AGs that I need to move, and you haven't talked about how to do that, there's a reason. So you can set up always on AGs in Azure for sure. It's, in my opinion, more complicated than doing it on-prem. There's a couple other components like a load balancer that you need that you didn't on-prem. But if you want what always on AGs give you, that uptime, the ability to fail over and all that, the higher tiers of Azure SQL are where you need to go, because you're getting all that without having to manage a cluster, manage the networking and all that. It's just data available always, right? So yeah, if you're sitting there thinking like, I've got AGs, I've got FCIs, when are you going to talk about my stuff? I just did. Okay, so you're probably wondering, well, how does this cost out? How am I going to sell my boss on this stuff? Or I'm at the early stages of a migration project. I need to understand how this stuff, well, what do I get for what I spend? So there's a couple different purchasing models here. There's the DTU based one, which MIs are, you can't buy them like that. And it basically it's a database transaction unit. So it's an abstraction of the collection of resources, CPU, memory, storage, all that kind of stuff. And these units buy you more performance and all those sorts of things. The Microsoft does have a document on it. There's an article by Andy Mallon, who's AMTWO on Twitter, called "What is a DTU?" It is the best article I've ever read on this stuff. So the official doc's there. You can click on it. Whatever. That article is better. It's the best swing at what this is that I've ever seen. So if you're really curious what this is, go read that there. More and more what you're seeing, though, both purchasing models are valid, neither one's going away. You're seeing vCore based models used more and more. And I think the reason is because executives understand that terminology more. They're used to buying SQL Server in cores. vCores are virtual cores, so you're not buying like the 2-core packs we would buy on prem. It's not quite that simple. But understanding resources in terms of vCores, at least for the managers and executives I've talked to, this makes a little more sense. I tell them, all right, you need 40 vCores, and they're like, oh, okay, got it. Where if I tell them you need 1,000 DTUs, they have no idea what that means. But again, both are valid. And you'll see if you walk through and provision one of these yourself, you'll see kind of how you can select these in the different tiers and things like that. So let's talk about some of the specialized tiers. So we've talked about kind of all the basic ones, the ones that have been around for a while. There are a couple newer ones that I want you to walk away knowing about. Hyperscale. So you may have heard it's like, well, Azure SQL, has a cap where I can't put databases up there beyond a certain size. That's true. Hyperscale kind of blows the lid off that. So it looks and acts just like Azure SQL, but the storage technology underneath it, which I've got a diagram here in about 3 slides, is very different. It's targeted to and optimized for workloads that are very large. So this has a cap, but it's 100 terabytes. The vast majority of my customers have never had one larger than that. There are, of course, shops that do. But if you're sitting there thinking like, well, this is all cool, I am ready to migrate some stuff to the cloud, but my database is 25 terabytes. Can I do that? You can, but right now it's got to be here. So it is resilient at the storage level by design. However, and we'll see this when we get to the diagram, if you provision one of these out of the box, and this is where I don't like the portal interface for this at all, compute nodes are all the way down at the bottom. As I recall, depending on the size of your screen, you actually have to scroll down. So if you don't scroll down out of the box, you'll get a single compute node. If that compute node fails, then your storage is still there. Your data doesn't go away, but you can't talk to it. So for true HA here, which it will manage for you, you have to go down there and provision at least 2 nodes. If it's just the one, there's no way to make it highly available. Like if there's a fundamental problem and it has an issue, you have a problem too. So I put that tip in there so you don't miss it. So we talked about what it supports size-wise. What's cool is backups and restores are nearly instantaneous. You may be sitting there saying like, well, Matt, that sounds a lot like marketing. That's kind of what I thought too, except it's true. I've used it. I've seen it. So it works on file snapshots stored in Azure Blob Storage. So all of the machines involved are not involved in the restores and backups because this stuff all lives off of them. So there's no IO impact on what you're doing. And if you've dealt with a very large database, you know how much of a pain this can be. Like you're talking backups that take a day. So if you're testing your restores like we all are, right? You can't do it sometimes. It just there is literally not enough time in a day to do that. This takes that out. So it's really, really nice there. You get higher log throughput than some of the other tiers because of what the design is. So this can, if you're on any other tier of Azure SQL and you're like, listen, the performance just isn't good enough for me, but I really like everything else PaaS gives me, and I don't want to go to manage instance, give Hyperscale a shot. It's pretty cool. And you can rapidly scale it out, scale it up, all those sorts of things. So similar to an always-on AG, if your workload is read heavy, you can provision more nodes and say, hey, reads, you go over here and hit this, and reads and writes, can go on kind of on their own. Also hot standbys if things need to fail over and stuff like that. But there are some things it doesn't do or some things I want you to know about. So elastic pools that we talked about earlier, not supported here. Just the design doesn't lend itself to them. And kind of a note for if any of you that have to talk to accountants, compute and storage is billed separately. I had a customer that was convinced that Microsoft was ripping them off and double billing them for their hyperscale setup. They weren't. It just, the bills are obtuse to start with, and yeah, the compute and storage fees are two different line items. So just kind of a tip there to be on the lookout for that if your accountants scour these bills. So I said we were going to talk about what it looks like, so let's do that. So you're going to see a lot of familiar terms here. We've got a buffer pool, we've got transaction logs, we've got where the process runs, we've got data files, but it looks a little different, right? We don't see anything called a log file on there. Certainly they exist, but it's under that log service. And you'll see it's using different tiers of Azure storage to manage both the log storage for the point in time restores that it can do, and also that landing zone, kind of where the activities taking place. That's on premium because you want it to go faster. Obviously, the speed of the storage that your transaction logs are on, pretty important. So you can see up top where I talked about that single node. So this diagram, and this came straight from docs. This provisions 3 nodes. If you take those two secondary nodes out, you can see the problem. You've got this one head node, the compute node falls over for whatever reason, you have nothing to fail over to. Where in this design, you have 2 to fail over to, you also have 2 that can handle just reads like we talked about on the last slide. And then you've got some caching layers and you see the snapshots down at the very bottom as well. So it kind of looks like a SQL Server underneath, but it's different. And I really think this architecture's got a future across different tiers of Azure SQL as well. There's a lot to like here. Let's also talk about serverless before we get to MIs and then kind of start rolling downhill. So serverless, dumb name, marketing wins. It's not actually serverless. These are servers. These are VMs, more or less. But what it is you can tell it, if you have a bursty workload, you can say, I need you to pull more stuff for me. As my workload starts to increase, I need you to automatically go pull some things out of the pool and give me those. I need that horsepower. And then when I'm done, you can put those back. So the way you configure these is it looks different from any other tier because you're configuring a min vCore and a max. So basically, at the quietest my workload is, I need 4 vCores for it. Let's say, I think the actual minimum is 2. You can't go any lower than that. But let's say you need 4. But let's say you're a fantasy football site. So on Sundays, that's as busy as you are, but there's no football games on Tuesdays, so nobody's doing much. On Sundays, you're going to need every bit of horsepower you've got. And the last I looked, the max vCores is 80. So you set that min and max both to establish what your workload's going to need, but it's also cost control as well. If you set the min vCores to 72 and the max vCores to 80, you're spending a lot of money. And odds are serverless probably isn't right for you because that's a pretty tight window too. This is for bursty workloads, like it says. There's also an auto pause delay as well. And basically what that is the amount of time you're telling it, because it's always analyzing it. It sees that the workload has gone down. There's not as much of a need for resources as there were. The auto pause basically tells it, okay, it's looked this way for an hour. We're probably good to start handing things back. And so you can configure that just what fits best for you. So again, like I said, intermittent usage patterns best suited to this. It is billed to the seconds. This is another thing that looks weird to the accountants here. And it's not the most responsive on scaling. So that seems a little counterintuitive based on what I just said, right? But it isn't, and it's because it's essentially pulling these VMs out of like a warm pool, saying, all right, come over here, we need your help. But there's some stuff that has to happen under the covers before those machines can really actively contribute. That takes 60 to 90 seconds, roughly. So if performance is critical and you don't have that 60 to 90 seconds to spare before you need that horsepower, there are some community scripts that help kind of preheat some of this stuff. My recollection is that DCAC has a script for this. I believe there are others out there. But yeah, just kind of be mindful of that. If you don't have a minute or two to spare while these get going and kind of find their legs, then seek out those those scripts, but most people running that 60 to 90 seconds is fine. So let's talk about MIs and how to connect to those before we start to wrap up. So managed instance, it's basically on-prem enterprise edition, and you'll note from the pricing, it's pretty much priced like that too. It is a PaaS offering, so it automatically patches, you get version updates, you get automated backups, you get HA failover, all that stuff. But it looks like a SQL server when you connect to it. And I've had migration projects where this was the chosen target because the DBA team felt most comfortable here. When they used Management Studio to hook into it, it had, for the most part, all the menu options they're used to, and it looked like a SQL server to them. That's where they went. Is that the right reason to choose this? No, but it is a reason. So how do we get to these? So I talked about when they would hook into it, it looked right. What does that mean? So secure public endpoint is one option. That is best for app access. We talked about surface area. We talked about getting your network and security folks involved. They're going to vote for this option. They're going to say the DBAs never need to connect to any of this. I don't care. The app can talk to it. That's fine, but it can only do it this way. Is that realistic? Probably not. But that's the posture they're going to start out with. If you need to connect to it, your DBAs probably will. There's probably stuff they need to go look at, queries they need to run, access to query store, things like that. You're going to set up some sort of site-to-site VPN or an express route. If it needs to go cross-region or you need to access it from a different VNet. So VNet, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a virtual network. And if you're not familiar with that term and you're tasked with a migration project, this is a good time to get your networking folks involved because they're going to know what that means and they're going to help you sort this out. Because managed instance, the networking around it is more complicated than the other stuff we've talked about. If you want to connect to an MI, but you don't want people to have access from their machines, you can set up a jump box, a modest VM without a lot of power. It does need to be on the same VNet as the managed instance to see it if everything's set up by default. This is not a session where we dive into the networking do's and don'ts around all this stuff. That's its own session. But if you're setting up an MI and you want to go talk to it and you're kind of just playing, set up the jump box, but it has to be on the same VNet as the MI itself is. So how are we moving this stuff? Before I jump into that, are there questions or comments here?
So Daniel just asked a great question.
Okay.
How would you determine a database or app should be an S4, S6, or whatever service tier when it goes into Azure SQL?
So I'm going to talk about this tool a little later, but as we only have about 10 minutes left, I won't be able to dive into it. So I'll mention it here now. So there's the database migration assistant so that's one way you analyze the feature compatibility and things like that. What comes along with that, and I believe you can actually download it separately as well. There is a tool from Microsoft that analyzes, you feed it a workload and you can automate this from the command line. I believe there's a modest GUI, but the command line is the way that I always do it. And perhaps the GUI doesn't actually exist now. It will analyze it and it will point you to the proper SKU that it thinks. So if you give it the right workload, you can run that and say, all right, this trace, this extended events stuff, go look at this, and it'll come back and it'll say, I think you need to be on Azure SQL database, standard tier with 20 vCores or something like that. So that's a more automated way to do it. You can also just test and use all the, whatever performance tools you have around your data and apps, just kind of lean on those. But there is a SKU analyzer that Microsoft gives us that's decent if we feed it the right workload data. Okay, so how are we migrating these? And this, I'll just kind of fire through these. There's no need to kind of deep dive in all these. The ones I want to deep dive into, we'll do that here in a couple slides. So we can replicate, actually. Replication's, gross, right? None of us like to work on it, but it is a valid migration path. Azure SQL can be a replication subscriber. So if we're looking to get data from an on-prem SQL server to Azure SQL database, something replication is perfectly valid answer. If we're looking to get to SQL Server on Azure VM, replication and log shipping work just like they would on-prem for us. That's just a VM that lives somewhere else. So as long as we've gotten our networking team involved and everything can see stuff in the cloud that it's supposed to, we can set this up. You can right click on a database in Management Studio and say migrate to Azure, and it will do it. That's really in the long version of this, I show that as a demo. It's a neat demo trick. It doesn't scale well. So databases of any moderate size, it takes forever. So you can do it if the database is small. It's pretty cool to show off. But databases that you're likely supporting, probably not up to the task there. You can bulk load to MIs as well. In the next slide, we're going to talk about some better ways to get things to MIs too. So if you if you run a lot of availability groups and you want to extend those availability groups to Azure and the plan is to continue using them, I discourage that plan. But if that's the plan, you can put a replica in Azure. Your networking and operations teams are going to have to be heavily involved here, and you can fail over to the replica in Azure, and that is a migration path. That's complicated. I've done it. Happy to chat about that offline. Not a recommended path, but is a path. Azure Migrate. So we'll talk about this on the next slide. It's really an umbrella of tools that Microsoft gives us to migrate all kinds of things. Now, more specifically to Azure SQL stuff. So log replay service, and this gets its own slide, is what Microsoft's going to recommend to you for the most part as a way to migrate to manage instances. I'll reserve my comments for when we get to that slide, but you can go look that up and see how it works. We'll talk a little bit on that slide how it works. I have some experience with this that hasn't been overly positive. There are two tools that I haven't seen a lot of marketing around these, and I really haven't seen a lot of content from these, but I saw a talk at Data Saturday Dallas from my friend Dan Taylor, and he mentioned these, and he works for Microsoft. They're using these, so I wanted to share that with this group too. So there's the Smart Bulk Copy tool, which basically uses the Bulk Copy API. It tries to logically partition the tables in the databases that you're moving so it can do concurrent kind of streaming up to this. There's a link on my resources slide that the doc goes into a deep dive about how everything works and how you can run it and all that, but I want you to be aware of it. It's a pretty slick tool, and again, just kind of not well marketed, but it can be a nice option for you. There's also, if you're using Azure Data Studio, there's an Azure SQL migration extension. That's on the resources slide as well. There's a couple documents around it, how to install the extension, how to walk through it, what it offers you, in terms of migrations both on and offline, things like that. So if you're using ADS, there's a fair amount of investment going into that extension, and that can be a nice option. But obviously, if you're doing this at scale, hundreds of databases, you're not going to want to do the GUI. You're going to want to automate it with something like Smart Bulk Copy or something like that. So Azure Migrate said we would talk about that. So here it is. It's best suited to kind of enterprise-wide moves. Like if you're migrating web servers, app servers, database servers, all that, Azure Migrate is kind of your one-stop shop. You're going to point it at servers and say, I want to move this stuff, and it's under the covers going to kind of direct you to the best way to do that. Microsoft calls it a unified approach of individual tools. It's probably a good way to think about it. But again, it's tailored to those individual server roles. I would say if you last used this a couple years ago, you're probably sitting there thinking like, well, Matt, you said I could move SQL servers this way, but I did it and it was no good. Me too. They've put a lot of work into that. The project I'm working on currently, we migrated database servers this way and it worked very well, just as they said. Unfortunately, LRS doesn't work very well. So Microsoft folks are going to tell you when you see them give a session on this, that this is kind of the new hotness, the recommended way to move a lot of databases to manage instance. Under the covers, it's basically log shipping. That's why I say kind of there. If you want to run it, you need SQL Server 2008 plus. You need full diff and log backups on. Checksum has to be enabled as well. Those backups need to go to an Azure Blob Storage container. So obviously you need to set that up, have the security set up and all that. LRS can run in two different modes. Autocomplete, which is basically saying move this database to this MI. The backups are in this blob storage. And when you're done, kill it. So it'll do it, then it will sever the link to the ground and it's done. If you want control over that, continuous mode is what that's called. You basically sever the link yourself. This, unfortunately, in my experience on my most recent project, didn't work very well. Happy to chat more about that offline. I know the team is working hard on it. We were in their ear about a lot of stuff, but in my opinion, this is not ready for prime time. But again, happy to chat more about that offline because we don't have the time here. Definitely try this, but keep your expectations low. I mentioned the data migration assistant. Again, this is a demo I usually do when we've got 75 minutes. But what this does is it kind of walks you through again, like, hey, there's stuff in your code that's going to break when you move. You can set the target as MI or Azure SQL, anything else. It will tell you things in agent jobs that'll break, things in code that'll break, and any sort of compatibility issues if you're using deprecated data types, things like that. It'll flag all that. There's also a way via PowerShell to automate this. You can do it at scale, but the GUI is nice. So what have we learned? Hopefully something. So understand how licensing is handled. We talked about, how we kind of price this out and what DTUs and vCores are, but we didn't talk about licensing. There's a good reason for that. Stick with your Microsoft rep on that. Depending on your size, you can get a lot of good deals in this space right now. They want you to migrate to Azure. They're going to make that easy, but they're not going to make it cheap. So talk to them about what offers would be possible for you, and the Azure hybrid benefit. So if you're in a migration project, you're starting one, you take nothing else away from the last hour. Azure hybrid benefit, if you have properly licensed Windows servers, works for that, and SQL servers as well. They cut a substantial discount on moving these to Azure SQL something. Substantial. I've seen in some cases it's 30 to 50%, sometimes more. So be aware of that. Use that. Make sure. So a couple other things. Make sure when you've migrated stuff, people know how to get to it. I was part of a project where I didn't send the email to the proper team, say, hey, your database moved. Here's how you get to it. So they came in, tried to connect to the old site, were very confused, yelled at me, rightly so. So I say, don't repeat the mistake that I made once. When you migrate things, communicate. Tell people when it's going to happen. Tell people that it's happening. Tell people that it happened and how to go look at it. For DBAs, modify the maintenance procedures you're doing now. MIs are going to be pretty similar. You're still going to be doing index rebuilds and things like that. You're not going to be doing backups. It's going to handle that for you. And you can set kind of what it does, but it's going to do that for you. But your maintenance, your index optimization, things like that, that may change. So, definitely be mindful of that as you move up. We talked about lift and shift not always being the right choice. We talked about knowing what the motivation is, and that's critical. So we spent the last half an hour talking about all the technical targets, the methods to move to those. If you don't know why you're doing it, you're not going to make the right technical call. And also knowing the politics in the organization, whether you're coming from outside or whether you're already there, those mountains we talked about in that first half, that knowledge is going to come in really handy. So those are some things I hope that you took away from this. These are links to the books that I got to help with. I call it the shill slide because I feel gross about this, but my wife is impressed when I sell a book. So if you found this handy and want a much deeper dive into all things migration, the one on the left I think is pretty good. Here are the resources. These slides are already up on my GitHub, so particular to Smart Bulk Copy and the ADS migration extension, hit those links there and learn all you want to know and more about that. Here's all the different ways to find me. Like I said, SQL at Speed everywhere online. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming. Hope there was good stuff in there. Kevin, are there any questions, comments, or concerns?
No questions. I think everybody is kind of lost in all of this. So I think, like everyone else, we've all been down this road, especially those of us who actually have migrated some over.
Yeah.
Every time you go through this, I've seen this presentation a few times and I enjoy it because I'm always reminded of something that either I didn't do or I could have done better, or there's something new that's come along
Yeah.
every time. So that's the thing to remember.
Yeah, these
So
slides changed in the last week because when I saw the talk in Dallas about a week ago and learned about smart bulk copy and knew that the ADS extension was ready and usable, this is an ever evolving space.
that's truly the thing to remember with this, because you'll never know everything you can do about it. People are always putting new things out there. And like Matt said at one point, you'll find a client, they'll want something very different each time.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you so much. Like I said, feel free to hit me up with feedback, questions, comments, any of these ways, and I'll stop running my mouth now.
No, all good, Matt. So with that, we do thank everyone for showing up. Remember to join us next time at DBA Fundamentals on October 18th, as we'll have Thomas Grosser talking about scaling clustered column stores. So with that, thank you all very much. Have a great day, a great week, and we'll talk at y'all soon.